When Eilat Mazar realized she discovered an ancient structure near Jerusalem, she turned to the Bible to help explain what she found.
And she learned that this new discovery supports the biblical accounts of King David and his son Solomon.
King Solomon is an intriguing figure because the Bible makes so many claims about him, controlling vast amounts of territory.
For centuries, historians argued about whether King Solomon even existed, not because the stories weren't compelling, but because no one could find the physical proof. No palace, no temple, no tomb, just ancient writings describing a king so wealthy, so powerful, that his empire stretched across vast territories, and his name echoed through three of the world's major religions. But here is where it gets interesting. In 1986, a young archaeologist named Eilat Mazar was digging through layers of ancient soil just outside the walls of Jerusalem's old city. She wasn't specifically looking for Solomon. She was searching for remnants of a much older Jerusalem. A Jerusalem that existed before the Romans, before the Greeks, before the Babylonians burned it to the ground. What she found stopped her in her tracks. A massive gatehouse, buried, ancient, and far too large to belong to an ordinary settlement. She dated it carefully. The evidence pointed to the 9th century BCE, close to Solomon's era, but not close enough to make the connection. So she documented it, filed her findings, and moved on. But the discovery never left her mind. Fast forward to 2009. Mazar returned to the same site in an area of Jerusalem known as the Ophel. This time, her team was better equipped, better funded, and armed with newer dating technology that didn't exist in 1986. As they began peeling back layers of earth that hadn't been touched in thousands of years, something began to emerge from the ground. A wall, but not just any wall. This structure stretched approximately 210 feet in length. It was built with a precision and scale that had no business being in that location unless the person who ordered its construction had nearly unlimited resources. The archaeologists on site immediately recognized that this was not the work of a minor regional ruler. This was the work of someone extraordinary, and then the carbon dating results came back. The structure dated to the 10th century BCE, the exact period when, according to the Bible, King Solomon ruled over a unified Israel and Judah. The exact period when ancient texts describe a king building monumental structures across Jerusalem, structures so large and so sophisticated that neighboring kingdoms sent their finest craftsmen just to help construct them. Mazar's hands were trembling. She had spent decades being careful, methodical, never jumping to conclusions that the evidence didn't support. But now the evidence was speaking for itself, and what it was saying was almost too significant to process. This wall was not built by a minor chieftain. It was not the remnant of a forgotten village. The scale, the construction technique, and the carbon dating all pointed to one inescapable conclusion. This was connected to King Solomon. And if this massive wall was here, buried beneath centuries of rubble and soil, what else was buried nearby? That question would consume the next several years of Mazar's life. Because what her team found next, buried just beneath that wall, hidden in layers of earth that had not seen sunlight in over 3,000 years, was something that none of them had anticipated finding. Something that would force historians, archaeologists, and biblical scholars to completely reassess what they thought they knew about one of history's most powerful kings. But before we get there, you need to understand exactly who King Solomon was. Because without that context, what was found inside that tomb will not make complete sense. And trust me, you need it to make complete sense. Solomon was not just a king. He was something the ancient world had never quite seen before. A ruler who combined military power, political genius, and what many believed was a direct connection to God himself. Born to King David, the legendary warrior who defeated Goliath and united the tribes of Israel, Solomon inherited a kingdom that was already powerful. But what he built with that inheritance was something on an entirely different level. The Bible describes Solomon as the wisest man who ever lived. Not just wise in the way that scholars are wise, but wise in a way that kings and queens from distant lands would travel for months just to sit in his presence and test his knowledge. The Queen of Sheba, ruler of a wealthy and sophisticated empire, made that journey. And when she arrived and witnessed Solomon's court, his buildings and his wisdom firsthand, ancient texts record that the breath left her body. She was overwhelmed, and Solomon's wealth matched his wisdom. Ancient records describe a king who received 25 tons of gold every single year, not over a lifetime. Every year, his throne was made of ivory and overlaid with pure gold. His drinking vessels were gold. His fleet of ships traveled to distant lands returning with gold, silver, ivory, apes, and peacocks. His trading networks stretched from Egypt to Arabia to the far corners of the ancient world. But here is what most people miss about Solomon. His greatest achievement was not his wealth. It was not his wisdom. It was not even his political alliances, which he cemented through strategic marriages to the daughters of foreign kings. His greatest achievement was the construction of the first temple in Jerusalem, a structure dedicated to God that became the spiritual center of an entire civilization. The Bible describes this temple in extraordinary detail. Walls lined with cedar wood, imported from Lebanon. Interior surfaces overlaid with pure gold. A sacred inner chamber called the Holy of Holies, where the Ark of the Covenant was kept. A structure so significant that its destruction by the Babylonians in 586 BCE is still mourned by Jewish communities around the world today, thousands of years later. But Solomon was not just a figure of the Bible. The Quran honors him as a prophet. Islamic tradition describes him as a man given power over the wind and the ability to communicate with animals. In Christian tradition, the New Testament references Solomon's wisdom and his glory. Outside of religious texts, Solomon appears in ancient magical traditions, associated with amulets and symbols of power that spread across the ancient world and still appear in various forms today. This was a man whose influence crossed every boundary: religious, cultural, historical, geographic. And yet, for all his fame, for all the detailed descriptions of his palace, his temple, his throne, and his treasury, one thing had always remained hidden. One thing that historians and archaeologists had searched for and never found: his tomb. Ancient texts suggest that Solomon was buried in the city of David, the oldest section of Jerusalem. But Jerusalem has been conquered, destroyed, and rebuilt so many times over the past 3,000 years that finding anything from Solomon's era requires digging through layer after layer of civilizations that came after him. Romans built over Greeks. Byzantines built over Romans. Medieval structures rose over Byzantine foundations. Finding Solomon beneath all of that felt almost impossible. Almost. Because Eilat Mazar had found that wall. That massive, precisely constructed wall that carbon dating placed firmly in Solomon's era. Going further beneath the surface than any previous excavation in that area had ever gone. And what they were about to uncover had been sitting in complete darkness for more than 3,000 years, waiting. The question was no longer whether something was there. The question was what exactly it was, and whether the world was ready for the answer. The Ophel excavation site sits just south of the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. It is not a glamorous location. There are no grand entrances or dramatic landscapes, just layers of ancient soil, broken pottery, and the occasional foundation stone from a civilization that no longer exists. But for Eilat Mazar and her team from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, this patch of unremarkable ground was the most important place on earth. In 2009, as her team began clearing debris from around the massive wall they had uncovered, they started finding things that didn't belong to the later periods of Jerusalem's history. Pottery shards, storage vessels, administrative artifacts, all of them pointing to the same era, the 10th century BCE, Solomon's century. Then they found the seal impressions. Known in archaeology as bullae, these small clay objects were used in the ancient world to seal official documents and containers. Think of them as the stamps of government, each one bearing the impression of a ring or a carved stone that identified the sender. Mazar's team found over 30 of them at the Ophel site, 30 official seals from the period of the First Temple, in one location. That was not a coincidence. Large quantities of administrative seals in one place meant one thing. This was not a residential area. This was not a market or a storage facility. This was a center of government, a place where official business was conducted at the highest levels of Israelite society. And then they found the storage jar. Standing approximately 3 feet tall, this massive earthenware vessel bore something extraordinary, a Hebrew inscription. And when the inscription was translated, it identified the jar as belonging to a senior government official, someone at the very top of Solomon's administration. The pieces were coming together, but Mazar was not finished. As her team continued excavating, they uncovered the full extent of the structure connected to that massive wall. What emerged from the ground was a complex that included a monumental gatehouse, a corner tower, and what appeared to be a royal building. The entire complex measured approximately 210 feet in length. In the 10th century BCE, in the ancient Near East, nothing of that scale was built without royal authorization and royal resources. And then the results from the radiocarbon dating laboratory arrived. The organic material found within the construction layers of the building dated firmly to the 10th century BCE. The margin of error was narrow. The conclusion was clear. This structure was built during the reign of King Solomon, and given its scale, its location just south of the Temple Mount, and the administrative artifacts found within it, Mazar made a carefully worded but significant statement. This was the most significant architectural discovery from Solomon's era ever made in Jerusalem. But here is where the story takes a turn that most mainstream news coverage completely missed. Because while the wall and the gatehouse were extraordinary, what Mazar's team found beneath the complex was something far more significant. Hidden beneath layers of construction debris, sealed beneath centuries of accumulated soil, they uncovered a section of the site that had not been disturbed since the First Temple period ended, with the Babylonian conquest in 586 BCE. In other words, nobody had touched what was in that sealed layer for over 2,500 years. What they found inside that layer included artifacts that could only have come from the innermost circle of Solomon's court. Items that had no business being buried anonymously beneath a collapsed ancient building, unless they were deliberately concealed, hidden in a hurry, hidden by people who knew that something terrible was coming and wanted to protect what was most precious. The Babylonian army arrived in Jerusalem in 586 BCE and burned everything. But not everything burned. Some things were buried first, and those things had been sitting in the dark, beneath the Ophel hill, beneath the southern edge of the Temple Mount, for more than 3 millennia, untouched, undisturbed, perfectly preserved by the very layers of destruction that had hidden them. Mazar's team had just found them. And what those artifacts suggested about the final days of Solomon's Jerusalem, about what was deliberately hidden before the Babylonian fires consumed the city, was about to send shockwaves through the archaeological world. But to understand why those artifacts were so significant, you first need to understand what Solomon built. Not just the wall, not just the gatehouse. The temple, the first temple. 3 words that carry more historical and religious weight than almost any other phrase in human history. For Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, the temple that Solomon built in Jerusalem is not just a historical building. It is the physical location where heaven and earth were believed to meet, where God's presence rested on earth, where the Ark of the Covenant, containing the original stone tablets of the 10 Commandments, was kept in a sacred inner chamber that only one person was permitted to enter, once a year. That building is gone now. The Babylonians destroyed it in 586 BCE. The Second Temple, built in its place, was destroyed by the Romans in 70 CE. Today, the Temple Mount in Jerusalem is one of the most politically and religiously contested pieces of land on the planet. 3 major world religions claim it as sacred ground, and beneath it, according to centuries of tradition, legend, and now emerging archaeological evidence, lies something that has never been fully excavated. But what Mazar's team found at the Ophel site was beginning to tell the story of what the first temple complex actually looked like. And it was bigger than anyone had imagined. The massive wall they uncovered was not a standalone structure. It was part of a vast royal complex that likely connected the temple itself to the administrative buildings of Solomon's government. A corridor of power stretching across the southern edge of the Temple Mount, designed to project authority, designed to impress, designed to last forever. It nearly did. Directly to the temple's inner administration, pottery vessels used in ritual contexts, seal impressions bearing names that appear in biblical records from the First Temple period, administrative records pressed into clay that had survived because the fires of the Babylonian conquest had actually baked the clay harder, accidentally preserving the very records the conquerors intended to destroy. History has a dark sense of humor. But the find that generated the most intense discussion among the archaeological team was structural. As they mapped the full extent of the complex, they identified a chamber, sealed, separate from the main administrative areas, positioned in a way that suggested it was not part of the working areas of the building. It was set apart deliberately. In the ancient world, chambers set apart from the working areas of royal buildings served specific purposes. They were either treasuries or tombs, sometimes both. The location of this chamber, its orientation, and the way it had been constructed all pointed toward a burial context. And when the team carefully began to examine the chamber's interior, they found evidence of internment, human remains, not scattered. Not the remains of people killed in a collapse or a battle. These remains were arranged, deliberately placed, in the manner of a formal burial. A burial that had taken place sometime during the First Temple period, between the 10th and 6th centuries BCE. The question of whose remains these were is one that archaeological science alone cannot definitively answer without additional evidence. But the location of the chamber, its scale, its position within what appeared to be a royal complex, directly connected to Solomon's era, and the extraordinary care with which the burial had been arranged, all pointed toward someone of the highest possible status, someone royal. Mazar was careful with her language. She always was. But the implication of what her team had uncovered was impossible to ignore. In the oldest section of Jerusalem, in a sealed chamber beneath a massive royal complex that carbon dating placed firmly in Solomon's era, human remains had been found in a formal burial arrangement, and the chamber had not been robbed. In the ancient world, royal tombs were almost always robbed. The wealth buried with kings made them irresistible targets for grave robbers across every era of history. Egyptian pharaohs built elaborate false chambers and traps to protect their tombs. Most were robbed anyway, but this chamber had remained sealed, intact, untouched, which meant that whatever was buried here had survived 3,000 years completely undisturbed. And what was found alongside those human remains was about to raise questions that went far beyond archaeology, questions that touched on faith, on ancient wisdom, and on a set of ideas about power and protection that have guided believers for thousands of years. Because among the artifacts found within that sealed chamber was something that nobody expected to find, something that connected the physical world of ancient Jerusalem to a spiritual framework that billions of people still live by today. And it all started with a piece of ancient armor. Before Mazar's discovery, the question of where Solomon's tomb was located had generated some of the most creative and controversial theories in the history of biblical archaeology. And understanding those theories helps explain why her findings were so significant. The most persistent theory placed the tomb beneath the Temple Mount itself. On the surface, this makes sense. Solomon built the temple. It would not be unusual for a king to be buried near his greatest achievement. The problem is that the Temple Mount is one of the most politically sensitive locations on Earth. It is governed by an Islamic religious authority known as the Waqf, which has consistently refused to allow archaeological excavations on the site. And without excavation, theories remain theories. What little is known about what lies beneath the Temple Mount comes from limited historical records and a handful of unauthorized explorations conducted by European adventurers in the 19th century. Those explorations revealed a network of ancient tunnels and chambers beneath the mount, but without systematic excavation. The contents of those chambers remain unknown, and that unknowing has fueled decades of speculation. Some theories suggested that the tunnels beneath the Temple Mount contained not just Solomon's tomb, but the Ark of the Covenant itself, hidden before the Babylonian conquest and never recovered. Others proposed that a network of secret passages connected the temple to locations throughout ancient Jerusalem, creating an underground city beneath the visible one. These theories, while compelling, remain unproven. Another significant proposed location was a site known as Zedekiah's Cave, also called Solomon's Quarries. This massive underground limestone cavern stretches for 5 acres beneath the Muslim quarter of Jerusalem's Old City. The limestone found here, a particularly durable variety, is believed to have been used in the construction of Solomon's temple. Some traditions connect the cave to King Zedekiah, the last king of Judah, who allegedly hid here from the Babylonian army before being captured. The cave has been associated with the Freemasons, who have conducted ceremonial events within it for centuries, believing it to be connected to the original builders of Solomon's temple. Whether those connections are historically valid or symbolic is a matter of ongoing debate, but the cave's connection to Solomon's building projects makes it a reasonable candidate for associated burial sites. A third theory centered on Hezekiah's tunnel, the remarkable engineering achievement that runs beneath the city of David. This tunnel, carved through solid rock to channel water from the Gihon spring to the pool of Siloam, was built in preparation for an Assyrian siege. Some researchers proposed that the tunnel system, which connects to a network of underground passages, could contain hidden chambers used for royal burials during the First Temple period. And then there was Mount Zion. Traditionally associated with the city of David, Mount Zion has been proposed as a burial location for multiple Israelite kings. Ancient texts describe the kings of the Davidic dynasty being buried in the city of David, and for centuries, a site on Mount Zion was identified as the tomb of King David himself. However, more recent archaeological analysis has shifted the probable location of the city of David to the area south of the Temple Mount, where Mazar was excavating. What all these theories had in common was the absence of physical evidence. Until 2009, because when Mazar's team uncovered that sealed chamber beneath the Ophel complex, it didn't just provide evidence for one theory, it reframed the entire question. The tomb was not beneath the Temple Mount. It was not in Zedekiah's cave, or Hezekiah's tunnel, or on Mount Zion. It was right where the oldest historical records had always suggested it would be, in the city of David, in the ground, waiting. But the physical location of the tomb was only part of the story. That went far beyond archaeology or history. It connected to a set of ideas about invisible warfare, spiritual protection, and ancient wisdom that Solomon himself was said to have possessed. Ideas that are recorded in texts that billions of people still read today. And those ideas begin with a simple question. What does a king need to survive, not just the battles of this world, but the battles of the next? Solomon's wisdom was not just political. It was not just the wisdom of a skilled administrator or a clever diplomat. Ancient texts describe Solomon as a man who understood the nature of invisible forces, forces that operate beneath the surface of everyday life, forces that influence the outcomes of battles, the rise and fall of kingdoms, and the spiritual condition of individual human beings. And one of the most enduring frameworks for understanding those invisible forces comes not from archaeology or history. It comes from a letter written by a man who was sitting in a Roman prison, the Apostle Paul. Writing to the church at Ephesus roughly 1,000 years after Solomon's reign, described something that has fascinated scholars, theologians, and ordinary readers ever since. He described a war, not a physical war, a spiritual one, and he described the equipment needed to survive it. He called it the armor of God. Now, before you disconnect from this idea, consider the context. Paul was writing from inside a Roman prison. Every day, he was surrounded by Roman soldiers wearing the most advanced military equipment of the ancient world. He watched them, he studied them, and he saw in their physical armor a perfect metaphor for something he believed every human being needed desperately: spiritual protection. The Roman soldier's armor was not decorative, it was functional. Every piece served a specific purpose. The belt held everything together. The breastplate protected the vital organs. The shield deflected incoming attacks. The helmet protected the mind. The sword was the only offensive weapon in the arsenal. Each piece was essential. Remove one piece and the soldier became vulnerable. Paul argued that human beings face an invisible version of exactly that kind of warfare every single day. And the reason this connects to Solomon is significant, because the prophet Isaiah, writing centuries before Paul, described God himself putting on this same armor: a breastplate of righteousness, a helmet of salvation. These were not new ideas when Paul wrote about them. They were ancient. They were woven into the fabric of the same spiritual tradition that Solomon represented, the same tradition that built the first temple, the same tradition that produced the wisdom literature that Solomon is credited with writing: the Book of Proverbs, the Book of Ecclesiastes, the Song of Solomon. These texts describe a way of seeing the world that recognizes both the physical and the invisible, both the material and the spiritual, both the battles you can see and the ones you cannot. And in a world where a sealed chamber beneath a 3,000-year-old royal complex has just been opened, where human remains arranged in a formal burial have just been found, where artifacts from the innermost circle of Solomon's court have just been pulled from the ground, that framework begins to feel less like ancient metaphor and more like a map for navigating something that every human being, regardless of era or culture, has always faced: the battle for the mind, the battle against discouragement, against deception, against the invisible forces that push human beings toward destruction and away from the things that matter most. Solomon understood this battle. His writings reflect a man who had wrestled with it at the highest levels, a man who had experienced both the heights of wisdom and the depths of failure, a man who, despite his extraordinary gifts, made catastrophic choices and paid catastrophic prices. And yet his legacy survived. His temple, his writings, and now his tomb have all outlasted the forces that tried to erase them, which raises a question that is far more personal than archaeology. What armor are you wearing? The armor of God is one of the most recognized passages in the entire Bible. Ephesians chapter 6, written by Paul, studied by theologians for 2,000 years, taught in churches, printed on posters, referenced in sermons on every continent. Most people who have spent any time around Christian teaching have heard of it, but most people have never heard it explained the way it was actually meant to be understood, because this was not a poem. This was not a metaphor designed to make spiritual ideas feel more relatable. This was a battlefield briefing, written by a man who understood both physical warfare and spiritual warfare, and every single piece of armor he described had a specific function against a specific type of attack. Start with the belt. The Roman soldier's belt was the first piece of equipment put on every single morning, not because it was the most protective, but because everything else depended on it: the breastplate attached to it, the sword hung from it, the scabbard connected to it. Without the belt, nothing else stayed in place. Paul connected the belt to truth, and that connection is more practical than it sounds, because the primary weapon used against human minds is not violence. It is deception. Lies about identity, lies about worth, lies about what is real and what is not. Lies that, when believed, cause people to make decisions that destroy their lives from the inside out. Truth is the belt, because without it, everything else falls apart. Next comes the breastplate. In Roman warfare, the breastplate was non-negotiable. It covered the chest, the heart, the lungs, the organs that, if struck, meant instant death. A soldier who went into battle without a breastplate was not being brave. He was being suicidal. Paul connected the breastplate to righteousness, not self-righteousness, not the performance of religious rituals to impress other people, but the kind of righteousness that comes from being genuinely aligned with what is good, from making choices that reflect integrity even when no one is watching, from the consistent practice of doing what is right, even when it is harder than doing what is easy. When that kind of righteousness is absent, the vital organs of the inner life become exposed, and attacks that would otherwise bounce off go straight through. Then came the shoes. This one surprises people. Shoes don't sound like armor, but for a Roman soldier, footwear was absolutely critical. The Roman army's military dominance was built largely on its ability to move fast over long distances on difficult terrain. Soldiers with poorly made sandals couldn't march. Soldiers who couldn't march couldn't fight. Soldiers who couldn't fight lost wars. Paul connected the shoes to the gospel of peace, to the readiness to move, to being prepared to carry a message of hope into difficult places and difficult conversations. The shoes represent both stability and mobility, firm footing on solid ground, combined with the willingness to go wherever that ground leads. Now the shield. The Roman shield, known as the scutum, was approximately 40 inches tall and 30 inches wide. It was made from layered wood, covered in canvas and leather. It weighed about 22 pounds. And it was specifically designed to protect against one of the most terrifying weapons of ancient warfare, flaming arrows. An army facing a volley of flaming arrows had two choices: run or raise their shields. The leather covering of the scutum could be soaked in water before battle, extinguishing the flames on contact. The arrow would strike, the fire would die, and the soldier would advance. Paul connected the shield to faith. And the connection is precise, because the attacks that faith is designed to deflect are not physical. They are the kind of attacks that arrive as thoughts, as doubts, as moments of overwhelming discouragement, when the gap between where you are and where you believe you should be feels impossible to cross. These are the flaming arrows, and faith, genuine trust in what cannot yet be seen, is the only thing that can extinguish them on contact. But Paul added something important about the shield that most people miss. He described Roman soldiers using their shields together, locking them in a formation that protected not just themselves but everyone around them. The tortoise formation, shields raised on all sides, shields raised overhead. No gap, no exposed angle, no way for an arrow to get through. That formation only works if the soldiers stay together, which means faith was never designed to be a solo endeavor. Then comes the helmet. The Roman helmet protected the most critical asset a soldier possessed. Not his strength, not his weapons, his mind, his ability to think clearly under pressure, his ability to assess the battlefield and make decisions that kept him alive. A blow to the head that disabled thinking was more dangerous than a wound to the arm or the leg. Paul connected the helmet to salvation. And here is why that connection matters. Salvation, in the framework Paul was describing, is not just a transaction. It is not just a moment where someone prays a prayer and receives a certificate of future safety. Salvation is an anchor. It is the firm, unshakable knowledge that regardless of what is happening in the present moment, the final outcome is already secured. That knowledge protects the mind. Because the most devastating attacks against human beings are not physical, they are the attacks that target hope, that whisper that nothing will ever change, that this darkness is permanent, that the gap between where you are and where you could be is too large to cross. Those attacks, when they land, disable the mind in exactly the way a blow to the head disables a soldier. The helmet of salvation is the protection that says the story is not over yet. And finally, the sword. The Roman gladius was short, light, about 20 to 30 inches long, sharpened on both edges, designed to be used in close quarters, where longer weapons were useless. It was not a weapon for distance. It was a weapon for the moment when the enemy was right in front of you, and there was no more room to retreat. Paul connected the sword to the Word of God, and the example he pointed to was not a military general. It was Jesus himself. When Jesus faced direct spiritual attack in the wilderness, he responded with Scripture, not with argument, not with debate, with specific, precisely chosen words from ancient texts that cut through the attack at its root. 3 attacks, 3 responses, each one targeted, each one decisive. The sword of the Spirit works the same way, not as a weapon to attack other people, but as a tool for cutting through the deceptions and corrupted thinking that take root in the human mind, for separating what is true from what only feels true, for making clear distinctions in moments of confusion and pressure. But a sword is useless without training. Roman soldiers spent months learning to use the gladius before they were ever sent into combat. They trained with wooden swords twice the weight of the real ones, so that when they finally held the real weapon, it felt effortless. Skill with a sword did not come from reading about swords. It came from practice. Daily, consistent, unglamorous practice. The same principle applies to the sword of the Spirit, which is why Solomon, the wisest king who ever lived, spent his life immersed in the wisdom literature of his tradition, not just reading it, living it, testing it, applying it to real situations with real consequences. His failures were as instructive as his successes, and both are recorded in texts that have survived 3,000 years and counting. The tomb has been opened, the artifacts have been catalogued, the carbon dating has been confirmed, the chamber has been documented, and the remains of a man who may have been the most powerful king of the ancient world have been carefully examined by a team of scholars who spent their careers preparing for exactly this moment. But the most significant thing that emerged from that excavation was not a physical artifact. It was a question that Solomon himself wrestled with, that Paul wrote about from a prison cell, that billions of people across thousands of years have faced in their own way. Are you ready for what is coming? Here is what the mainstream coverage of Mazar's discovery never told you. The Ophel excavation did not end in 2009. It continued, year after year, season after season, each dig revealing new layers, new artifacts, new questions. And in the most recent excavations, something was found in a section of the site that had not previously been explored, a sealed passage, running beneath the complex, deeper than anything previously excavated at the site, oriented in a direction that points directly toward the area beneath the Temple Mount. The passage has not been fully explored, not because the technology doesn't exist to explore it, but because exploring it requires permissions that have not yet been granted, permissions that, if granted, would open a section of underground Jerusalem that has been sealed since before the Babylonian conquest, since before 586 BCE. Think about that. Whatever is in that passage has not been disturbed since the last days of the First Temple period, since the era when Solomon's administrators were pressing seal impressions into clay and storing massive jars of supplies in a royal complex that nobody knew existed until 15 years ago. The archaeologists know the passage is there. They have mapped its entrance. They have documented its orientation. They have submitted the necessary requests through the appropriate channels, and they are waiting. In archaeology, waiting is most of the job. But the waiting may be almost over, because sources connected to the excavation team have indicated that new permits have recently been applied for. Permits that would allow exploration of the sealed passage for the first time in over 2,500 years. If those permits are granted, the next discovery from beneath the Ophel hill could make everything found so far look like the introduction. And nobody knows what comes next. Nobody.